Okay, here is a quick little video just to help you guys get started on this specific nice challenge. It's about setting up logs and setting up a log server. So overall, quick walkthrough, they want you to go through and set up a syslog server on the domain controller and also forward all logs to the domain controller. So the VMs that we're going to need are the domain controller, the file share, the prod Joomla, and then we're also going to need the database as well. So I'm going to walk through just a little bit and just walk through kind of setting these up for you. So, sorry, one sec. Let's get the domain controller up and running first. So, as this boots up, the first couple of files that you need to install are located right here. We have the syslog watcher tool. You can go ahead and just accept all the defaults when you go through and install it. It'll install, it'll fire up, add a little syslog watcher icon down at the bottom there. And then the other one that we're going to need to fire up is the event log inspector 3. And this is the tool that we'll be installing on all the other Windows boxes. And there's only one other, it's just the database. So you'll notice it doesn't bring anything up once you fire that up, but that's okay, we'll get to it in just a second. So the syslog watcher is the actual syslog tool. So syslog is a tool that we utilize for gathering logged information. It's a open standard for logging. It's quite useful for kind of going through and setting a lot of things up. So for actual configuration, we'll go into the settings here. And a couple of things that we're going to be kind of configuring right out of the gate is we know that we need to set up some form of initial alerting. So we need to set up exporting of specific files. And so we'll set up right now is just export all incoming messages to a specific file. And then for the destination, they wanted us to create a folder on our desktop with the IP address of our specific system. And the IP address for this system is 172.16.30.55. And so we'll select that, and then that will be our primary. And then for the encoding type, in one of the areas, it wanted you to change from UTF-16 to UTF-8 and process it as a CSV file. So we'll go ahead and say OK, and then we'll go ahead and start the syslog service. So while that's starting up, the next thing that we're going to want to actually configure is the event log inspector. And so what event log inspector does is it will change your regular Windows event logs and forward them as syslog information to a syslog server. In this case, we're still taking our event logs that are coming directly from our domain controller, but we're going to be forwarding them to the local syslog watcher tool as syslog events, so that we can have all of our logs in a single area. So first couple things you'll note is the service is stopped, and then also the startup type is set to manual. We'll need to change those, but we'll get back to it in a sec. So over in the settings section, very first thing underneath general is we want to make sure that this file starts on startup. This program starts on startup. Next thing that we're going to look at is the syslog tool, and then we need to point it to the actual syslog server. And so we're going to point it to ourselves here at 172.16.30.55. We can test pinging, that works, and we can even test sending a syslog message and we'll see that that's successful, and you can see the message goes back behind there as well. So victory, that all seems to be working. So we'll then go ahead and click apply, save our settings, and then go back to general, and we'll start the event log service, change it to automatic. And then the next thing that we also want to kind of take a look at too is forwarding. What type of messages do we want to forward? And per the directions, it didn't want you to send all information, only most of the information. So what we're going to do is set up a specific permission rule. We'll add our rule. It's fine to leave it as the name. We'll change the event type, and we want to log for info warning errors and failure audits, but we can uncheck success audits because that's typically a pretty low level event that actually occurs. So we can click OK, we can click apply, save the setting, and that should be all that we need to do for the domain controller. And you can start seeing that we can see a lot of informational things that are starting to pop up. So yay, things are working. Now, one thing to note is that it does take a while for this to actually process and to go through. So again, it can take about 3 minutes to refresh, so just be patient with it as it kind of goes through. So if we look at, say, like the database, this is also a Windows system. And you can say yes to that, doesn't really matter. And then we're also going to be installing the event log inspector on this device as well. So once that's set up, same type of thing. We'll open up the event log inspector on our database. We'll go over to settings, and same thing, make sure that it runs on startup. Enter in the server that we want traffic to forward to. And again, we can test pinging, and we can test sending a packet, and that works just fine. And then same thing on the forwarding side of things. We can change it so that the event type is the exact same. We want info, warning, errors, failure audits. And it probably doesn't hurt if you leave success audit, but I disabled it and checkbox went green, so that works. For database exporting as well, we don't technically really need to set that up, but we can. So same thing, we can set up our events here because this is a database and we want to monitor for it. Do the exact same thing. Make sure you apply your rule sets, and everything else looks fine. So we can go back to our event, change that to start, and then if you really want, you can change the startup to automatic as well. And that's really all you have to do to get the event log working. And so same thing, we can start to see that database alerts are starting to come in. So we have Active Directory alerts and we have database alerts. Oh, the one thing we forgot to do underneath settings. Actually, nope, should be all good. So everything should be working there. And we can see that our alerts for the Active Directory are working, so that means database will likely pop up here shortly as well. So the next couple ones to show you really quickly is I'm going to show you the prod Joomla, and then we're also going to do the firewall as well really quickly. So first thing to note is they basically state, right, we don't know what tool actually exists for Linux, so you'll have to figure that out. So all I did to kind of figure that out was I basically just went to Google or DuckDuckGo in my case. I basically just looked up and I was like, hey, how do you configure remote logging for Ubuntu? And the very primary tool that comes up is rsyslog. And so typically this is built into most Ubuntu systems as the primary tool, but if it's not there, you can go through the installation process. So a couple things to kind of look at is we want to make sure that it's installed, or if it's there, so you can use the rsyslog d-v command to check, or you can just go ahead and try and install it as well. So to do that, we can say sudo apt get install rsyslog, and then tac-y just to say yes to any pop-ups that might show up. So turns out rsyslog is already up and running for us, so yay. So the next thing to kind of note is that in the specific document that I found for kind of setting up rsyslog, we're not setting up rsyslog as basically the server. We want to set it up as a remote client. So we want it to actually send traffic back to a remote syslog server. So to do that, we need to make some edits to the syslog config file. So to do that, we'll say sudo and then your editor of choice. I like nano personally. So we'll say sudo nano and then etc, and then the config file is rsyslog.conf. And what we need to do is just go down to the very bottom where there's a new line, and what we're going to add in is just a comment here. So that a comment means that the computer won't read this specific line, but it's there for us to understand what this command is doing. And we're just going to say send logs to remote syslog server over UDP. And then to actually make it so that this works, we set up our permissions, which is off priv dot star, which basically just says anything that follows after the period works, the space, and then the @ and then the IP address of our syslog server, which is 172.16.30.55, and then colon, and then the syslog port, which is 514. And then we'll save the file with Control-O, and then exit out with Control-X. And if things are working, we should start seeing traffic coming from that prod Joomla server here shortly. But typically, once you've made a change to that specific file, we do typically have to restart that specific service. So we'll restart the service and say sudo systemctl restart our syslog. And that'll restart our syslog for us. And then we should start seeing traffic to come over. And you can see I have traffic from the www, which is 10.100. And so if I do a IPA, we can see that my address is 10.100. So syslog servers are making it over. So yay, that's a good sign. So again, that'll take a minute for that to kind of go through. For setting it up on the file share, it's pretty much the exact same commands. So again, just to kind of go through it, first command there is, let me just clear my screen real fast. So very first command, make sure that syslog is installed. Next command, modify the rsyslog config file. Go all the way to the very bottom of that file and add in the following lines. So send logs to remote syslog server over UDP. And then the final thing that you want to do is restart so that those new config changes take place. So you can do the exact same thing over on the file share server, and that should do it as well. Now the next device is the firewall, and that is a pfSense firewall. So a couple things that we can do is, one, we can connect into it, and we want a shell, so I'm going to enter in 8. And all I want to know is I just want to know the IP address of the actual system that we're connecting up to. And I actually didn't even need to get into a shell. I can see that the IP address that I'm connected up to is 172.16.30.250. So that's the production side of things, and that's what we're going to be connected up to. So because it's pfSense, it does have a web client that we can utilize. And so what we're going to do is just open up, say, our good friend Windows Explorer, and we can go to 172.16.30.250 and then continue to the site. It'll ask for login credentials, and the credentials for this is admin and password 123. So for this, if you're not familiar with pfSense, what I did, again, for kind of just going through, I don't really work too much on the dashboard, but for configuring it, same thing. I went through and I basically just went and found a guide for how to configure remote syslog configuration. And it walks through general steps. So what we have to do is, the very first thing is we go to the status side of things, go to system logs, and then we go to the settings option, and at the very, very bottom we want to enable remote logging, and it will ask for an IP address, and same thing, we punch in the IP address of our system, and then the :514 port, which is that, and then per the directions we want to send system and firewall events, and then we hit save, and there you go. That's the general gist of what you have to do. It'll take a bit for those two things to kind of go through and log, but that's it. So hopefully that helped. If you do have questions, please let me know. Should be like a general walkthrough for you guys, and yeah, thanks, bye.